Hi everybody, this is Anne. The beginning point of learning pottery for many people is spending hours practicing throwing clay on the wheel, making lots of cylinders and bowls. Of course that gets boring after a while and we naturally search for that next step forward. In this video, I'm going to show you a bit of where I started and give you an idea of how to alter some of those plain thrown bowls and hopefully inspire you to move forward in your own clay journey. I actually created this bowl about 15 years ago. I kept it as I liked the combination of the random design of the slip with the more detailed bird drawings on an altered bowl form. I kept it as a prototype. Little did I know it would become my inspiration for drawing and eventually painting full color on my pottery. I thought it was finally time to try and replicate it. Maybe it'll be an inspiration for you. I started with 1.5 pounds of clay. I always start to wedge the clay using the spiral technique, then I switch to ram's head and roll it into a nice cylinder shape. I like to flatten the top and bottom, making sure there's no air pockets, especially at the bottom. I wet the center of the bat, then slam the cylinder down. I pounded it along the side to make sure it stuck tight to the bat. To center the clay, I started by pressing down with the side of one hand on the side of the mound and supporting it with my other hand. I then coned it between my hands so that the clay started to go upwards towards the center. I used the side of my hand to push the cone back downward for the final centering. I used my thumbs to hollow out the mound, but making sure that I had at least 1/2 inch of clay at the bottom for trimming. I then began to pull the walls outward using my thumbs. You can see that the rim began to split from dryness. I compressed the rim back together and added a little water, then continued to extend the wall outward with my damp sponge. For this bowl, I'm pulling the walls outward a little more than the measurement of what the final floor will actually be. I'll show you why in a minute. To pull up on the wall, I started at the bat and pushed some of the clay at the bottom inward with my sponge. I started to push inward against the bowl wall, which begins to move the clay upward. At the same time, I pushed from the inside of the bowl out, so it comes up and out. I made several pulls like that, trying to get rid of the bulk of the clay at the bottom. You'll see that the pushing inward motion each time I pull decreases the floor diameter, which is why I start with the bigger floor area. I then used my rubber rib to smooth the outside of the bowl wall. I also smoothed out the inside of the bowl with the same rib. I rounded off the rim of the bowl with my fingers, but you can also use a chamois or a wet paper towel to do it. I used my pointed tool to trim excess clay away from the foot. I decided to push the rim outward just a little more for the altering. Then I covered it with plastic loosely and let it dry to a soft leather hard. I wired it off the bat and turned it over and centered it. I secured it in place with lugs. I started by trimming the foot down a little bit and rounding off that bulge of clay along the wall of the foot. For the foot, I like to start by defining a stopping point for when I trim out the center, so I'll have a nice foot for it to sit on. I then trim out the inside and smooth my trimming lines away. I use my fingers to round off that foot. Now that I have the bowl trimmed, it's still soft enough to alter. I took my lugs away and used my needle tool to mark the center of the bowl. The sides of my bat are marked perfectly with dots from north, south, east, and west. I moved my wheel head so south is facing me directly. I placed a piece of string from north over top the center of the bowl, then straight to the south dot. When I had my string straight from one side to the other, I traced it lightly with my needle tool. Using a small ruler, I measured 1/4 inch on either side of the traced line and marked it from one side of the bowl to the other. I connected all the dots. I used my sharp X-Acto-type tool to cut along both of those lines. This is why it's important that your clay is still a soft leather hard, especially at the rim. If the rim is too dry, there's a greater chance of it cracking. Notice that I started in the center, cutting my lines straight towards me on this side of the bowl. Then I turned the wheel head around and cut the opposite side the same way. I then removed that center section of the bowl. I moved the two sides apart a bit so I could get my hands in there to work. That tool did a great job cutting without any ripping, cracking, or much cleanup, so the sides will fit back together easily. I scored both sides and slipped one of the sides, then pushed them together. I made sure the seams were straight over the entire bowl, and then joined them together along the seams. I used my rubber rib to add some pressure to the joint. I turned over the bowl and made sure the inner seam was also nice and flush and tightly joined together. I actually didn't need it on this bowl, but working a coil into the seam is added protection against cracking. And here is my finished altered oval bowl. I like my seams to show on the outside of the bowl, but you can also rib them flat. To recreate a version of my original bowl, I wanted to come up with a similar way to decorate it that won't intimidate even the non-drawers. And here's a bowl I made earlier with the same alteration that is now bone dry. For the supplies, I purchased this cheesecloth at my local grocery store. I began to pull the strings from the loose weave to create more of an organic intertwined look. I needed the final fabric to be long enough to stretch around the circumference of my bowl. I made up a slip with teal blue mason stain and slip from my reclaim bucket that resembled the color of the original bowl. I laid my cheesecloth strands along my work table and spritzed just a little water down over the cloth so the cotton would stick to the table. I then flared out the individual strands a bit so I could color them easily. I laid some of the blue slip into the water and over the strands to load them with the blue slip. I made sure each strand was coated. I then picked up the rope of cheesecloth and laid it down around the rim of the bowl. It stuck down easily. I didn't want a tight circle, but I wanted it to look loose. I took another strand and placed that over top of the first strand so that they would look intertwined. Once those were down, I created a couple more strands and wrapped those around the area towards the foot. When I had those placed like I wanted, I used a damp sponge and cleaned up any drips or fingerprints that I didn't like. And here's what I came up with. I let the slip soak into the clay for a few minutes. When the strands were still damp, I removed them to reveal the random pattern underneath. Of course, there were some bald spots and places I wanted to touch up, so I used a small fingernail detailer brush to fill those in and get the design how I wanted it. Oh Oh, this is definitely a lot less messy than my original bowl, and I like those intertwined lines. Plus, now I have a blank center spot for my birds to rest. I created these silhouettes of birds and tested them to make sure they were small enough to fit into the center section where I wanted them. I'll be doing this technique upside down as it's easier for you guys to see in the video. I wet the paper with my paintbrush, then added a layer of black underglaze to the bird. While it was wet, I laid the paper in the spot where I wanted it and pressed it down with my fingernail. I pulled the paper off to reveal the bird. I love that some of the underglaze transferred and the areas that didn't look like highlights. I still wanted to see the outline though, so I used my tiny brush and outlined the bird with black underglaze. And here he is, sitting on the blue lines of the bowl. Now here's a bowl I made earlier where I continued that bird pattern all the way around the piece. I glazed the borders with Amico honeydew and around the rest of the imagery and inside the bowl with my white liner glaze. It's a much cleaner design than the original, plus it's an easy decoration so you guys can follow along too. Thanks to the newest members of our Little Street Pottery Research Facility team. If you'd like to join the team and earn a title, click on the Super Thanks button or the link to buy me a coffee. In any case, we invite you to subscribe to our channel and we'll see you next time in the studio.